Good morning, John Cavanaugh. Thank you, Paracon. Thank you, OCA, and happy to be here. So we're going to be a little bit more practical, still follow the standards because that's what we do. But what we want to demonstrate today is how do we apply some of this stuff? So I was thinking about it, I've researched it, and if you Google the term data supply chain, you won't find very much. So I thought about, well, let's talk about a supply chain, but then let's also incorporate why we're here, right? So a data supply chain is how we work. And if the supply chain has a defect, a vulnerability, we're not able to work. So if you remember CrowdStrike, there was nothing wrong with my system, but CrowdStrike released a untested patch, and it basically prevented my good working application and good working laptop to stop working. Now, for those institutions that had remote rebuild or remote reboot type facilities, no big issue. One of our friends, one of my children's friends, is a physician's assistant. He works in cancer. He works in Philadelphia, and I happened to see him after that. And I said, "Hey, were you guys impacted?" He says, "Yeah, we were all sent home. We couldn't do our medical work because they could not reboot fast enough." So stuff happens every day. So we'll talk about a supply chain. We also have a lot of volunteer work with Alan. Alan will speak officially for the government, but I will refer to CISA from how we apply some of the things. So secure by design is, I don't think it's a mandated, but it's a common sense approach. So we have also subscribed and we are following secure by design for our own policies. So
and if you get stuck, you aim it over there.
Actually, it's over there.
Oh, it's over there.
okay, so I had this animated, but for some reason our Zoom presentation software was arguing with Cavanaugh. So now you're seeing it all. So if this was 5 years ago, 2020, we wouldn't be here because we were under COVID restrictions. And if you recall, there was a global supply chain issue about gloves and masks, right? So we had a vulnerability, we had a defect in the supply chain. A software supply chain now has been defined as, in an executive order, hey, if you have a application, what are the components and versions of those components in an application, fondly known as a software bill of materials. Now, I come from a manufacturing background. Bill of materials has been used in manufacturing for probably 30 years. So it's not an unfamiliar term. As we built out a knowledge graph in 2020, we had ideas about how do we improve communications. So if we begin to treat things as a knowledge graph, we've been collect a lot of stuff, said, oh, in 2021, let's collect software, right? So we built an SBOM. Now, in 2021, 2022, we said, wait a minute, nobody buys or builds software without installing it. Where is the componentry of a build? And we didn't really find a good one. There are some versions in Cyclone DX. SPDX was more license-based, so they're trying to get to those components. But if somebody knows of a really good format for taking components in building an application, I would love to know. But we've created one we call a release bill of materials. So what does that mean? These are the components necessary to run your app. And we'll get into that because Duncan and I have had some positive and some slightly gapped conversations and agreements on that. But now we're going to talk about the data supply chain, right? So digital data is really what we're talking about. So we heard from AWS. We just heard from Christina about data provenance. So all of these things rely upon data. We have to define what data is, and then we have to manage it. So I did a Copilot search. Why not? And you can read it, right? It says it's something that's stored in digital format. Next month, I will have my 50th year anniversary from graduating from my bachelor's of electrical engineering, where I first learned about an analog computer, and then we had a digital version of that, and then we had a hybrid version. So for 50 years, I've been carrying around analog versus digital, right? And in a data supply chain, we're pretty much just digital, zeros and ones. We are deterministic. So we'll hear more about that as we get into AI. And then the last, so that's my thought, right? We write applications to make a record, digital record of a human activity. If you've ever bought a car, if you've ever bought a house, there's a whole bunch of emotions and physical things that you're doing, but it gets recorded in, hey, you got approved. Here's a loan. So now you can use some physical. So my animation is turned off at the moment, but yesterday was right of boom, right? So we have all of these standards, and at the output of a Styx taxi cacao effort, right? We now have this cacao record. Do something. Here's a problem, do something. How do we then say, how can we do it better? So you can't see in the upper quadrant there, but I'll show that later. That left of boom is now, before there's an event, what did we design? How was it built? And what you're seeing there is something that we've built, which is a complete visual view of our knowledge graph that has all the current vulnerabilities by criticality. And you can filter it by criticality or application. So when Neil was saying, hey, you know, we have a vision, we should be able to do this. We're working with a large integrator now that is engaged under contract with a very large DoD agency. And that's exactly what they want, right? If there's a vulnerability of a moderate or high or critical, and it's not resolved in 21 days, it gets plugged, the plug gets pulled, it's out of production. And they have no way to get this centralized view. So that's what we're learning to. And then in the lower left, it's hard to read, but you'll see what is tech debt? Well, we're making these represent as kind of like rocks. Like you're coming in, you're on the water, you're safe, and now you're beginning to slow down because you're running over some rocks. We're going to be talking about two types. One, tech debt is how many versions are you out, and then security debt, how many vulnerabilities do you need. And as you begin to go up the standard stack, you come out to our product, which is a view of how vulnerable or what's your assurance that you can actually do the digital work that you need. So for the last 20 years, maybe longer, on the left, we've used open source. And if you put a valuation, Duncan, show me the money, it rates the third highest in terms of GDP next to US, then China on a world market. Right? It is a very, very valuable asset. And maintaining version control and knowledge of your open source componentry is the challenge. On the right side, we now see the theft or opportunities of theft growing because of open source predominantly, but also there's a lot of misconfigurations. And as Neil said, our life has now gotten very complex. We've got hybrid digital data, we've got cloud digital data, some people have multi-cloud digital data. Maintaining all of this in a continuous way, it's challenging. So what we want to talk about is let's combine both, right? Left and right of boom. How do we get cacao playbooks? And I've borrowed Duncan's witchy-watchy methodology. How do we get these cacao books now into our knowledge graph? And if we now have built and learned that there's a deficiency, how do we return for the next build? Right? So that's what we've been working on. And in the case of pace, right? How do we maintain it? How do we measure it? How can I give the board or CEO a one-shot view? Am I in business? Am I making money? How can I go down to the CIO level? How am I operating my intellectual property and all of my digital operations down to the CISO level? What is my security vulnerability? And very down to the analyst level. So that's what our focus has been. And if we come up with a posture score that's relevant to a given organization at any level, you know at a glance, like CrowdStrike, nobody knew, right? You were down. How fast could you get back up? And the reason I'm still doing this, right, is not for money necessarily. It's mostly for my kids and my grandkids. I am concerned that the amount of complexity is not being addressed fast. So I'm here today to say, I'm willing to do whatever to move the ball faster, whether it's with my product or your product, it doesn't matter. This is why I'm here. And we start off with SBOMs. And SBOMs now are the keys, that's the cornerstone. It's understood. But then we're talking about the other elements that an SBOM will use. And what you'll see then is, as we go from digital data, from applications, and now we begin to use that digital data to use in AI modeling, it's all connected. You have to be able to see at a glance pedigree, provenance, and we have to be able to say, here's a hashed record and a history of where we are right now. And then finally, so vulnerability exploitation. So yesterday we talked about Kev and two artifacts coming out of the federal government. In the NVD, we collect the official record of vulnerabilities. We then also maintain exploitation value in a Kev. We then add and enrich that signal, right? So there's another group in first.org, ESS. They're giving us a daily refresh. And then we also have partnerships with other startups. So now we're down to hourly updates of exploits. So now we have a very rich signal coming in of, this is your version, this is your component version and exploitation. And we can now prioritize much faster. So how we tie that into Cacao, that's what I want to help. So at 3 o'clock or 3 to 5 or whenever we're going to do it, we're going to start building now a real example, right? So we heard from Manny, we're the #1 attacked US government agency, right? In the State Department. What did we hear from Charlie? We are 9 meals away from an inflection. Well, I'm going to use those two factors and say, we are how many minutes away from a multi-sector attack where electricity and datacom and physical devices all now get impacted in a multi-sector attack, right? And maybe that's a future interoperability example that we can build a simulation.
When you can add to yours, ask Bo Woods, I think it's Bo's data. I think it's a hospital can survive 9 minutes without water. Take the water supply from a hospital, it shuts down in 9 minutes.
Right. So, and then the very last one, right? We're all working on AI model trust. So we need a lot of these pieces to be connected. And in fact, in today's world, right, the federal government is doing something it's never done before. It's downsizing. Now, most of us in private industry.
I'm sorry, it's done. You have to be old enough.
So, but we have to be sensitive to the fact that even if you're just retiring and there's no downtime, there's a knowledge loss. And we need to now build back the system that retains that knowledge, right? So that will be leading into AI model trust. If I went to Duncan and he was at AT&T or any company and he said, and I said, here's a question, and he gave an answer, I would trust him because he has that pedigree. If he left AT&T, he's no, and they had, we have no longer a concurrency of knowledge, right? He can still remember. Tom's another good example for stuff that he's done, or I'm a good example for stuff that I've done. Once we're not here for any reason, where's the knowledge? It's gone, right? So we have to use the new digital tools and build up a AI model trust that can be valid and used. So we looked at this in 2020 and we said, listen, there's a lot of, we don't want to displace current data. So we heard yesterday with sticks and taxi and how we know there's numerous silos of data. So we call that all stratum one. And we want to be able to ingest the relevant stratum one data into a second layer called our knowledge graph. And we're using Neo4j. It's a good database for us. But we saw yesterday, it's a little complex. There's a lot of moving circles and lines. So we have a third level which extracts out all of that. Right? So you don't have to worry about writing your own queries. So I can give a dashboard to the CEO and he gets his one number. What's my assurance posture? Am I making money today? And I can give with role-based access all the way down to the lowest analyst, whatever details. We'll show you that. And we had 4 pillars, right? So from Christina about provenance, we recognized this back in 2020 when we began to design our system. So we start off with user session provenance, right? Zero trust. Somebody has a priori knowledge. Am I making a web app for you? Am I making a mobile app for you? So we have to have some blueprint, some architecture that says we're putting in AWS or maybe Azure and AWS. So all of these standards are built in user session prototype. Then we come and say, well, what controls? What industry are you in? And from Christina, there's many, right? So if you're PCI, PHI, in the government, there's data privacy, and also a number of legal restrictions, and then requirements profiles. How many have been in projects? Let's go to a project meeting. Oh, here's the minutes from a project. Oh, here's an Excel from a project. And we get into this version control issue of Duncan wrote it, Patrick changed it. I come in later. Am I using Patrick's or Duncan's original version, right? So we put that into our knowledge graph as well, right? And then we got down to, oh, here comes an executive order. Well, let's focus on how do we do code and code provenance, right? So everyone's getting to automated CI/CD pipelines, and there are many types. You can use GitHub, you can use Azure, you can use AWS. So we're not changing them, but we recognize we have to connect to them and we have to extract from them to get back on posture score. So these 4 things here are elements. The little circles are stratum 1, the middle circle is stratum 2, that's our code, our knowledge graph, and then up top is our, I don't know if you can drag the that box. Just
Which box?
this one up here. Can you just click on that and drag it, make it a little bit bigger? No,
you
it's okay.
can.
Okay. All right, so we'll come to that later, but it's hard to see, but that's basically one of our dashboards, right? You can get a view of the SBOM's vulnerabilities, the RBOM vulnerabilities, and then we have a automated controls compliance. Pick whatever framework you want, this 853 or any other ones, and all of this now is automated as part of a knowledge graph. Then on the lower right, you can't hardly see it, but maybe you'll see it on Zoom. That is one of our drop-down details. So now an analyst can go right into the application and see not only what are the component versions, what are the vulnerabilities by CVE, but is there a fix? And oftentimes there is. So we should catch this very early in the pipeline, right? In the dev, we should not go to SIT with these known vulnerabilities. So we finally get through a pipeline and now we've put it into production. To Neil's question, tomorrow a new CVE comes out. We automatically rescore. So you can see a new posture change. You can say, that's exactly where I want to go. Tomorrow, or the next interoperable village, we'd like to now take a cacao book, right, and tie it into our knowledge graph or push from our knowledge graph back to an automated cacao book and say, this is a good situation today. Tomorrow we have a vulnerability and here's the format to go fix it. And then eventually, depending on the sophistication of the group, maybe get to OpenC2 and say, this is a simple fix. can push it automatically without human intervention. So what we're talking about now is our knowledge graph just being that red block, right? So with Peraton, you've got a lot of technology, you've got a lot of clients. One of the things we're looking to do is help, right? Bring our technology to either an end user or a system integrator and say, you can now move faster, right? So we continue to work with the government agencies like CISA, but we have to move faster. Like that's really the bottom line. And I'm here for the rest of the day. So we will be at the working session. We'll have some examples of the product that you can drive and touch. And we'll talk about how we can make it fun.
Thank you, John. 5+ minutes for questions. Any questions? So I have one then.
Okay.
Since I actually used some of your data in one of my slides, can you say a little bit more? Again, I'm a show me the money guy. I mentioned show me the money. Say a little bit more to the extent you can. I realize you're constrained a certain amount, but say a little bit more. Two-part question. One, on savings your customers have gotten through software transparency and caring about this stuff. And two, if you have any examples that you're allowed to say of serendipitous savings. In other words, there's savings because you're, like Cassie's example of the P-Search saving, it was sort of predicted ahead of time. I know in my case, when I was first doing them way back when, we had all sorts of, hey, we didn't realize we had 3 copies of that in there kind of savings. Can you speak to any sort of real world? Because again, that's what people can bring back to say, hey, we should be doing this because.
Right. So first question is, in an organization, how many hands and feet do you have? Right? That's the first question. Second one is, how many products do you sell? Right? I had some large clients, right? I'd go into AIG and say, in this particular group, how many products do you sell? They had no clue, right? So then how many application releases do you have? Very difficult question. So once we get 3 or 4 answers, we can come back and say, well, if we automated just this one piece, it's this type of savings. If we then go expand across it, because we're going to be continually building, accumulating faster and faster releases. So if I said to you in AT&T, if you didn't remediate in an hour, if it took you 2 hours or 10 hours or a day, could you articulate what that cost was? It's hard. It's really hard to do.
Yeah, except for and since I no longer work there, I can say, no, I have real examples of when that's happened and it did cost us quite a lot.
Yeah. But I mean, that's
1990 comes to mind.
Yeah, so we're not going to give you a dollar and cents number. We're going to give you kind of a formula and you can put in whatever variables you know.
Well, that's a future thing. I'm saying, can you say anything about, without revealing customer names or too many details about, no, we have customers that saved Blump by doing Blump.
Not yet. Okay, can't answer that. Okay. Any other questions?
I'll inquire, just tell me about how people tend to interact with the visual knowledge graph, right?
So, yep, good question. So our internal research, we've contacted about 250 of the Fortune 500 CISOs. And the #1 need is a visual snapshot of vulnerabilities right now. Neil alluded to the same thing. In the future, I'd like to be able to see this. In fact, your old CTO, his name escapes me at the moment, that was one of the things he said. I don't want to make any more calls. I don't want to send any emails. I want to see a screen and I want to see a vulnerability and I want to hit a button and it wants a cacao button, right? I just want it done. So that seems to be the #1. So translating all of this sticks, all this cool stuff into something visual is really what they want to see.
Cool. And with no other questions, thank you, John.
Okay.